All right, tonight we're going to finish up the series of studies we've been doing on death and dying. I will not be here next week. I'm going to go down and be with Joanne. She was going to come home Friday or Saturday, just be here for 3 days, and she's already exhausted. And I said, look, that's silly to drive 7 hours back for 3 days and 7 hours back. You're going to be tired after your rest. So anyway, I asked the elders about taking a vacation week, going down, and I don't know where we're going to go because there's not a lot of places to stay, but I'm going to get her away from the house because even when she's not on duty with her mom, she gets called in a lot, and I can tell she is worn out, and it's not looking good. But anyway, so tonight will be the final. I actually plan to go through next week with this study. But I want to begin by asking you a question. What happens when you draw your last breath? You know, I really figured some smart guy could say you're dead, but that's almost it. But what happens? You ever think about that? Okay, the spirit leaves the body, but how much do you know about what happens that instant you draw that last breath? The spirit leaves the body, as Joe just pointed out. And I realize that death is not something that we like to talk about, is it? I mean, if you want to ruin the office holiday party, just sit down at the buffet with somebody and say, hey, what do you think about dying? Yeah, get some fun. Probably some people would get up and move. Or Thanksgiving, you know, the family's all there and you know somebody's slicing the turkey and everybody's waiting and, hey, are you guys ready to die? I heard the story, and this was told as the truth. This preacher had encouraged the congregation on Sunday to talk to people about eternity and death and preparation. This guy was a barber. And every client that would come in for a haircut, he'd say, I'm going to ask. And he'd get cold feet, and he'd chicken out, and they'd leave. Well, it's 5 o'clock. The last customer sits down in the chair, and he's stropping that razor. And he said, it's now or never, you know. So he's stropping the razor, looks at the guy and says, say, buddy, are you ready to die? That's not the way to go about it, discussing it. But let's face it, we don't like to talk about death. Maybe it's out of fear. Maybe it's out of ignorance. You know, we're afraid of upsetting people. But yet it seems to me, since we all know what's going to happen, unless, of course, we're still alive when the Lord returns, we all know what's going to happen, then it seems like we would want to know about it, wouldn't we? We want to know as much as humanly possible. Suppose, and I'm going to use Ned for an example. You know, Ned won't be offended here, and he's in the line of fire. But suppose Ned boss calls him in tomorrow and says, say, Ned, I got good news for you. We're going to transfer you to our plant in Tonawanda. Tonawanda, what? Never heard of it. Oh, it's a great place, Ned. You're going to love it. The people are nice. The climate's great. We need you there. What can you tell me about it? Oh, well, it's a great place. Now, what's the first thing Ned's going to do when he leaves the boss's office? Maybe look for a job. What else? He's going to have the old... He's Googling as he walks down the hall about this place, Tonawanda. And I don't guess there's any place by that name. I just made it up. But he's going to find out about it, right? I mean, it could be in the heart of Muslim country. It could be in the middle of the desert. He wants to know something about where he's going to be going, where he's being transferred with his job. Well, we know we're going to be leaving this life. You know, we know this place. We know where we are now. But what lies beyond? And you say, oh, well, heaven. Or hell. What do we really know about it? Obviously, that's all. We're limited our knowledge to what God's Word says. And as far as what happens at death, how much information do we have? Okay, what God sees fit to tell. That's a good idea. In fact, you know, the Old Testament, if you start looking, the Old Testament says very little about death. Now, frequently it says, you know, Abraham gave up the ghost and he died. Or so-and-so died and he was buried with his fathers. Or so-and-so was killed in battle. There are quite a few but as far as what happens, the Old Testament says very little. In fact, the New Testament doesn't give us a lot. Now, it gives more than the Old Testament. In fact, would you think of come to mind that give us some details? Luke 16, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, but what other two? All right, Revelation tells us some, but two others in more detail. That didn't give us a lot of detail. What about 1 Corinthians 15? That tells us quite a bit about the resurrection, about what's going to take place, at the return. And the other passage that comes to mind, and maybe you can think of some others, would be 1 Thessalonians 4. Gives us quite a bit of information about what's going to take place. As I say, the New Testament has a few passages, and you could have wondered, maybe I'm the only one that has these questions come to mind when I'm studying. Okay, here's Lazarus. Jesus says, roll away the stone, and you remember the objection, Lord, he's been dead 4 days, by now he stinks. But they move the stone, and Jesus cries out, Lazarus come forth, and Lazarus comes out, still bound in those burial shroud garments. And he tells the people, what? Turn him loose. Obviously, he was bound up, and that's a mystery to me within itself, how he came out of there unless he just floated. Because his legs and arms would have been bound like a mummy. That was the traditional way of preparing the body for burial. And so he says, cut him loose, let him free. What's the first thing Lazarus said? It's not a joke. But have you ever wondered about that? Did Lazarus have any remembrance of what he had seen in the hereafter? If he did, and I've often wondered, did Mary and Martha getting back to the house, say, tell us, what was it like? Come on, brother, you got to remember something. What did you see? Was it pretty? Was it beautiful? Did you see anybody you knew? You can imagine all the questions, and nothing is recorded. And for that matter, if you study all of the resurrection accounts, Eutychus was only dead a few minutes. He fell out of the window and Paul raised him up. But there's nothing said that he recorded anything or spoke anything about what he had seen or heard. And Dorcas, the daughter of Jairus. And you got to wonder, did they have any memory of it? Was it blotted from their minds? I used to enjoy watching the MASH series. And I don't know if you remember the one, if you watched it, where Major Winchester had a bullet go through his hat, just that close to his head. And he suddenly became obsessed with death and dying. And men who were almost dead, as soon as they woke up, what did you see? What happened? Tell me about it. He was just obsessed with learning about what happened at death, even to the point that he volunteered to go up to one of the aid stations, which was right on the line. And as someone died, he was watching, trying to find. And that's a televised example of what I'm talking about. A lot of people are curious, aren't they? It's amazing how many books you can find if you will do a search or go to Amazon, some of these online searches. How many books have been written telling about death and dying? But if you look at them, it's all speculation. Because nobody has ever, if you'll pardon the pun, nobody has ever lived to tell about dying, have they? Nobody's ever come back to tell about it. Now, some were resurrected, but they didn't tell about it. So again, I emphasize that what we're talking about tonight, we are very limited. And even with these few passages we have, there are more questions I can ask than I can answer. Because God has not chosen to satisfy our curiosity by answering questions that aren't important. But on the other hand, we are given some very important information. Turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 16. I want us to center our study on Luke chapter 16. And I know you're familiar with this passage, but I want to look at it from a little different perspective. Luke chapter 16, beginning with verse 19. There was, and I emphasize that, there was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. Then he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldest send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Abraham saith unto him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went unto them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. Now, before we actually get into it, I want to mention some people will try to tell you that this is a parable. There's nothing in this text that would indicate this is a parable. In fact, the only reason they try to say it's a parable is to get away from or to get around some of the teachings that are found. But as I emphasized there when we begin reading verse 19, notice what it says. There was a certain rich man. That's not parabolic language. Not only that, and we've mentioned this before in sermons, that if this is a parable, it is the only parable in which an individual is named. In parables, usually it's a certain man went forth to sow, a certain farmer, a certain woman, whatever. They're never called by name. This would be the only one in Scripture if it's a parable that calls someone by name. But even if it is a parable, let's suppose just for making an argument, making the point, that this is a parable. What does that change? Doesn't change anything. What is a parable, strictly speaking? Give me a definition of a parable. What? 2 bowls. There's one in every crowd. It's a way of teaching, but how would you define a parable? Exactly. A parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It used things that people were familiar with, such as a certain farmer went forth to sow. And they could see that. This was an everyday occurrence, a farmer walking through the field, broadcasting seed. Or the fishermen out here casting their nets out of the boats. Parables taught truth. And so even if we grant for a moment that this is a parable, it doesn't change what's being taught. It just means it's parabolic language rather than literal language. And I also realize something else. As we look at this passage, this story is about man's intermediate condition. This is not heaven, and this is not hell. This is the awaiting place. This is someone called it the waiting room of eternity. Now, however, from my study, you may know of something different. Maybe I've missed it. But from my study, I can't find any difference between the Hadean world, where these 2 men are, temporarily, and what it's going to be like in eternity. In both situations, the righteous, the saved, are going to be blessed. They're going to be in paradise. Likewise, those who were lost are going to be in torment. In fact, what would be the only difference between this intermediate state and heaven or hell? The great gulf? But what else? Another one, though. Well, there hasn't been a judgment yet, but something else. What? Temporary. Exactly. This is a temporary situation. After the judgment, it will be eternal.
There has been a judgment. And who judges who goes where?
Well, we go there automatically at death. We're going to talk about that. Let me put you off. That's one of the last points I deal with. Let me just put you off on that. I don't want to jump ahead and get out of sequence here. But other than that, I don't see any difference between this place, which is known as torment or Tartarus and hell. One's temporary, one's eternal. This place, paradise, known as Abraham's bosom here in this text. What's the difference in it in heaven? One's temporary, one's eternal. Now, I want to make some observations here. At death, what happened to Lazarus at death? Okay. So here, assuming this is a principle that's applicable for all time, at death, our spirits, our souls are going to be carried away by the angels. I find it interesting what is not said about the beggar. No, the beggar. Nothing is said about his burial. In fact, as a poor man, as a beggar, probably, and I'm just saying this is very probable based on what went on, his body would have been taken out and dumped in a community tomb, a potter's field. The poor folks' burial. Now, on the other hand, the rich man, we are told the rich man died and what? He was buried. And we can imagine that, as a wealthy man, there were a lot of mourners there. Because after the funeral, there's going to be food and drink, right? All the relatives are going to be there. You can imagine a big crowd, a fancy funeral. But yet, what happened at death with their remains has nothing to do with what's going to happen afterwards. And I think that is very significant. Now, before you ask, the answer is I don't know. Because somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, explain this about the angels. We're not told how. We're not given any details, just simply the fact that he was carried away, borne away, one translation says, by the angels. And as I was preparing these notes, how many of you remember the movie Ghost with Demi Moore, Whoopi Goldberg, Patrick Swayze? And I could not think of the bad guy's name. Doesn't matter. But do you remember when the bad guy dies, he's trying to eliminate Whoopi Goldberg and Demi Moore, and the big piece of glass comes down and kills him, and his spirit comes out. It's a black, misty figure, and these demons escort his spirit away, kicking and screaming. Well, see, that's not set forth in Scripture. Nothing is said about that, but I couldn't help but think of that because here we have Lazarus being borne away by the angels, but the rich man has just simply said that he was buried. Now, when we die, we're going to enter what or where? What? The waiting place, but what is it? All right, it's called the Hadean world. We're going to either go in the Hadean world or sometimes it's referred to as Hades, just like the rich man and Lazarus here. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, what is Hades? What is the Hadean world? Well, literally, the word Hades comes from the name of the Greek king of the underworld. He was known as the god of the dead, but in time, that Greek word Hades came not as much to refer to this mythological king. It came to refer to the world of the dead, the underworld, as we might call it, the home of departed spirits. And from Luke chapter 16, we get somewhat of a picture of what we're talking about here. Visualize, if you would, for just a moment, a large sphere. And I don't know that it's round, that's just the way I'm portraying it. But just visualize a large sphere, and this sphere is cut in half. There are two halves. And running right through the middle of this sphere, there is a large stream, a gulf, a division. And again, don't ask because the Bible doesn't say. When it says a gulf, that doesn't necessarily mean it's water. And if you start reading, you'll find all kind of speculation as to what this gulf is. But it's a separation there. Now, what's the purpose of this gulf that separates the two halves? Abraham told the rich man that we're separated by this great gulf so that those who would come from you to us can't. And those who would go from us to you can't. It's a separation. So it doesn't matter what it is. The point is it separates these two halves. Now, one of these halves of this sphere is known, as I said a moment ago, as paradise or Abraham's bosom. It's described as a beautiful place. It's a place of comfort where men are attended by angels, as Lazarus was. But now on the other half, we have just the opposite extreme. It's a place known as torment or Tartarus. Literally a place of anguish. Somebody read verses 23 and 24 for us again. And notice here, he only wanted a drop of water. That's how tormented he was. He didn't ask for a cup of water. He didn't ask for a glass of water, even a spoonful. Just a drop would have been a relief to him. And by the way, if you're using the King James, it says, in hell he lifted up his eyes. This, the King James translates, but it should be the word Hades. This is not hell in the sense of the eternal place. It's simply in the Hadean world, literally. He lifted up his eyes, was in torment. Now, again, there's this great gulf that separates these two halves, as we see there in verse 26. But it would seem that even though this gulf separates paradise from Tartarus, what can the people on either side do? They're obviously, well, I don't know about conversation. There is no conversation across, well, I don't know where Abraham was. I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, but what I'm looking for, though, is vision. Vision. Well, yep, that's in a minute. I'll put you off a minute. Everybody's trying to get ahead. So, there was vision. He could look over and he could see what? Lazarus, his old neighbor, his friend. And surely if he can look over and see and recognize Lazarus, Lazarus probably was able to look over and see him, although I wouldn't argue that point with you. But what does that tell you? Or what does that seem to imply? He looks over, hey, there's Lazarus. Send Lazarus and let him bring me some water on his finger. Okay, wake in memory, but that's not what I'm looking for yet. Recognition, exactly, Shirley. There'll be knowledge of one another. How did he know who Lazarus was? And for that matter, how did he know who Abraham was? Now, I've heard all of the arguments. Well, I won't say I've heard all of them, but there were a lot of arguments you'll hear. Well, how do you know he lived in the time frame of Abraham? I don't. The apostles on the mountain of transfiguration, remember, who did they see on the mountain with Jesus? What? Moses? Elijah? How did they know who Moses and Elijah were? They've been dead a long time. Obviously, there is the ability to know, to recognize, even though it's somebody that we may not have been contemporary with. But somebody says, well, wait a minute. If there's recognition in eternity, and I get to heaven, and I look around and I don't see my grandmother, I don't see my child, I don't see my brother or sister, whoever. If I don't see my loved one, I'm going to be unhappy. Well, possibly on the surface, what? Okay, Jeff goes to my next point here. Twice in the book of Revelation, it says, God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Now, I wouldn't argue this point, but it seems logical to me that, yes, there would be sorrow. If I get to heaven and I look around and I don't see my loved one here, and I realize, oh, they're lost. That would make me sad. But God is going to wipe those tears away. Now, how He does it, I don't know. Possibly He may just blot them from our memories. But all I can say is He promises to wipe away all tears. How He's going to do it doesn't matter as long as it happens. Yeah. But the point these people are making, though, is, we're going to be happy in heaven, and if I'm there and my child's not, I'm not going to be happy. Yeah. Okay. Did you get your hand up, Jeff, or you? Okay. So, this whole argument that there's not going to be recognition just does not, I don't think it holds water. Because here you got the rich man looking over, he knows who Abraham was, he knows who Lazarus was. But see, the problem, I've heard that, but the problem with that, Abraham could see him and recognize him. Well, I mean, I think the whole thing, everything that's going on will be miraculous, if you will. But I'm saying you've got both sides being able to see one another. You got the rich man seeing Lazarus. The rich man seeing Lazarus, but you've also got Abraham seeing the rich man. So, don't know. And again, I wouldn't argue these points because they're not, some of them are very, they're not deep. They're very shallow, a lot of implication there. But there's something else. Yes? Well, definitely there's going to be the wailing and gnashing of teeth. Well, the wailing and gnashing of teeth, though, the word there comes from intense pain. This is not emotional. They are in torment in the flame. And if you do a word study on those terms there, weeping and gnashing of teeth, the gnashing of teeth there literally is to bite, to grind the teeth out of extreme pain. But here's something else that we look at that we realize when we leave this life, death, nothing left behind is going to matter. Look at these two men. Their social situations, their financial situations here had no bearing in the next life. In this life, the man who's wearing a $1,000 suit, and he's driving a Ferrari, and he's got, jewelry, obviously expensive jewelry, the manicured nails, expensive shoes. It's clear he's got money. That money is going to do what for him? No, in this life. It opens doors, doesn't it? The guy shows up at a restaurant and he wants a table and they look at him and it's obvious this guy's loaded. They're going to come a lot closer to finding him a table than they are if you show up in blue jeans and a t-shirt and say, hey, we want a table. But in the next life, it's not going to matter. The rich man in this life, I don't know how rich he was, but he's described as a rich man. But his money did him no good. He couldn't even buy a drop of water, could he? And here's Lazarus over here who was destitute, literally. Here was a man who was forced to sit outside. And by the way, it was common. You think, well, why would the rich man allow this beggar to sit outside his door? Because it was common. The poor, the beggars, would sit outside and they would wait for scraps to be thrown out. Here's a man that's forced to beg for the leftovers that are being thrown into the street for the dogs or whatever. That's how destitute. But yet in the next life, he's being attended by angels. He's in paradise. Yes, Barb? He's comforted. Yes. We're not told why. Well, but we're not told. It could have been a lot of things. I don't know. That was, I'm sure, part of it. But the point is, here was a man who was lost. That's the key. We're not told why he was lost. It could have been any number of things, or it could have been a plurality of things. But the point being that their situations in this life had nothing to do with their destiny. In fact, they were just the opposite, weren't they? The rich man in life became what? A beggar in torment. And the beggar in life became rich in paradise. And when we leave this life, everything we have is going to be left behind. We're not going to take anything with us. And, yep. Yeah. And perhaps, and this is just kind of a side note here, maybe this is one of the reasons we're told that the common people, the poor people, heard Jesus gladly, Matthew 12:37, because he offered to the poor something that they couldn't have otherwise. And I know we talk about poor, but we don't know what poverty is in this country. I mean, what we call poverty, there are people around the world that would trade places in a heartbeat to have our poverty. There were no social programs in biblical times. A beggar was a beggar. He had to rely day to day. Read the book of Ruth. Those women would have to go out and scrounge the crops that the harvesters left behind. They'd get enough maybe to feed them a meal in the evening. And the next day it was the same thing. It wasn't a matter of, we got in the cupboard to eat today. It was day-to-day sustenance. And so here comes Jesus, and then later the apostles and the early Christians, offering them eternal life, the water of life, a mansion in heaven, something that they could never hope to have in this life, a mansion or an abundance. And yet here's the gospel offering them this. And so that's why they heard him. That's why they welcomed him. And the same is true. We found this in Costa Rica. I know some of you have been to Costa Rica with the various campaigns. You know, the wealthy people, it's hard to reach. It's the poor people that are so open to the gospel, because here it's something they can have that they can never hope to have in this life. Randy, were you with us in San Ramon when we went into that nicer neighborhood? Leonzio took us into that nice neighborhood. They all had cars in the drives. Did you go with us on that one? We've only gone to a couple. He wanted us to go there, and we knocked all afternoon, and we didn't get a single Bible study. I mean, we went to houses, they had intercoms on the door, which over here is not uncommon, but in Costa Rica it is. They weren't interested. But we went out into a very poor area on the other side of San Ramon. These houses had dirt floors, open sewage. It was filthy. And the people would listen. They'd let us teach them. And so I think that's one of the attractions of the gospel to the poor, is that they can have something that they couldn't otherwise have in this world. But something else, and I think somebody mentioned this a little bit earlier, in death we're still going to have our memory. Notice what the rich man is told by Abraham there. He said, "Son, remember that in thy lifetime thou receivest thy good things." Not only that, the rich man could remember his 5 brethren back in this life. And to me, that would have been one of the torments that he's would have to live with, the fact that his 5 brothers, unless something changes, they're going to be coming there too. They're going to be joining him in this place. Of course, after death, there's no coming back and changing our destiny. Once we enter the Hadean world, we're there to stay. It's permanent until the judgment. In fact, if you look at 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and 14, Paul says that the righteous dead are going to come with the Lord for the resurrection. Now, obviously, if the righteous dead are going to come with the Lord for the resurrection, then they've got to leave the Hadean world to come with him. And we're not going to take time to read that passage. But then if you drop down to verse 17, he goes on to say that those which are alive, that is the righteous living, and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. And of course, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the transformation, the change. Verse 50, he said, "Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven." And he goes on to say, this mortal must put on immortality. To paraphrase it, this physical must put on spiritual. This earthly must put on a heavenly body. And that's the change that's going to take place, he says, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, when the Lord returns. Now, the question was raised, and we've only got a couple of minutes left. If we already know our sentence, in other words, the rich man, I think, pretty well knew he was lost. Lazarus pretty well knew that he was with the saved. So why would there be a judgment? Why would there be a judgment if they knew their destiny? What's the purpose? Look at Romans 14, 10, and 11. There are 2 answers given. At least as I see it, these are the 2 answers. Paul says, "But why dost thou judge thy brother, or why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ." So there's the context, the judgment, standing before the judgment seat of Christ. "For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord," notice, 2 things, "every knee shall bow." Where? When? At the judgment. Every knee is going to bow at the judgment. Secondly, "and every tongue shall confess to God." Where and when? The judgment. It's going to be a day of vindication. It's like today, if you're convicted of a crime, for example, here's a man that's convicted of bank robbery, and the jury, the foreman stands up, and the judge says, "If you reached a verdict, yes, Your Honor, we find the defendant guilty as charged." And what does the judge do? Does he sentence him right there? Usually they say, "Oh, it sets a sentencing date. It may be a month later, a couple of months later, whatever." And they come back and they pronounce sentence. So even in our society, we don't always pronounce judgment. Even though the guy knows he's guilty, he knows he's going to prison or maybe worse, he just doesn't know exactly what the sentence is going to be. So in this case, I think the judgment is going to be so that every knee will bow before Christ, every tongue will confess. There'll be no atheist in the judgment. There'll be no agnostics in the day of judgment. Yeah, it'd be kind of hard to be one, wouldn't it? And it doesn't say this, but you can just visualize in the day of judgment the begging and the pleading that's going on. You know, these people that have argued, well, you know, God did this and God did that. You know, I could never serve a God. Well, they will change their tune. Barbara?
Would that also be the judgment? But also, I mean, we know when the Lord wants to well, the devil does too, but that's when he's letting the devil go about doing, you know, trying to get the people to do that. So isn't that like the devil?
I'm not following your question. Well, of course, Revelation tells us that he's going to be bound, and Satan, I think, knows his eternal destiny. But as far as humans go, I think our purpose for the judgment is going to be to receive if you will, a formal sentencing, and that those who've denied Christ, they're going to acknowledge, they're going to confess Him. Every knee is going to bow. And somebody says, well, do we know our destiny the moment we die? Well, I think so. Did Lazarus know immediately? I mean, you know, if the angels come and get you when you die, that's a good sign, isn't it? Well, yeah. Well, it just vindicates the Lord, though. It just says, because He says, all men shall stand before Him in judgment. Well, no, they already know. It's just basically a sentencing. The judgment is not going to be to determine guilt and innocence, because that's already determined. You know if you're lost, you know if you're saved the moment you die. But it's a time of sentencing, basically. Just like I said in our courts today. Why do we have a sentencing? The guy knows he's guilty. He's already... So's that guy, well, they haven't been sentenced formally. They're just being held. Yeah. 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 But once you have been found guilty, you go back and you're sentenced. Well, obviously they know they're guilty. The rich man knew, but in the judgment it is going to be a sentencing time. No. No. And again, I think the idea I said from Romans 14 there, so that every knee will bow and every tongue shall confess. Yeah. And of course, some people obviously will know what they've done and why they're lost, but there will be some people probably that don't realize, maybe don't understand, and in the judgment it'll come out. Yeah. 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 I want to say I think some will be in the judgment. Well, why am I lost? You know, I was religious. I was a good person, a good moral person.
Well, we should find comfort knowing we're in these sides of that course. I do. Because even when you have the accident, and then you say several weeks later, you found it. He said, I like that. It doesn't have to be that the angels would come. He said, I hope one of them is the archangel Gabriel. I like to meet.
All right. Well, our time is up. I haven't heard the bell, but according to that clock, it's a couple of minutes after. So appreciate your comments.